Hey, what's going on, teachers? I'm doing a second video here to talk a little bit about the third lesson I do in Unit 3, which is following our discussion of GDP and the circuit flow diagram. This is where I usually introduce the business cycle. And be aware, this is not where the textbook introduces the business cycle. They introduced it way back in like Module 1 or Module 2. I like to save it for this point because without understanding GDP, I feel like the business cycle doesn't make quite as much sense. So if you're like me and you'd rather introduce it at this point, or maybe you just forgot to introduce it earlier, which is perfectly fine, this is the video for you. We're going to do a real quick run through on what it is the kids need to know about the business cycle and exactly what we can do with it. So since this is our lesson on economic indicators, we're going to primarily focus on the three indicators and how we can tell what portion of the business cycle we're on in relation to those indicators. So we're going to focus on what is GDP doing at various points in the business cycle, what is inflation doing at various points in the business cycle, and what is the unemployment rate doing at various points in the business cycle. But before we can get into those indicators, which is our primary interest, let's just take a look at some terminology and make sure that we understand exactly what the business cycle looks like. So the model for the business cycle has GDP on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And essentially what it shows is that the economy tends to ebb and flow given a long enough period of time. So right now we're in the good times, and we like to think the good times will never end, but we know at some point the economy is going to go back into a recession. So the kids will need to be able to point out exactly what the names of the different parts of the business cycle are. So when the business cycle is at its peak and we're doing as well as we can possibly do, that is called the peak. The area that takes us from the peak to the trough is what's known as a recession. The kids often will want to label this depression. Just let them know that a depression is just a really long recession. Their depression isn't its own separate thing. When the economy bottoms out and things are as bad as they can possibly get, we call that the trough. And then when the economy starts to grow, we call that either a recovery. Sometimes we call that economic expansion as well. So this particular cycle ebbs and flows. We know that it's pretty much always ebbed and flowed in market economies. So what we do want to know now is exactly how do the three big economic indicators relate to the 4 points on the business cycle. So how do the economic indicators relate to peaks, recessions, troughs, and recoveries? Before we can do that, I do want to introduce that there are some relationships the kids will need to remember between the economic indicators. And I know we're getting a little bit ahead because we haven't covered inflation and unemployment yet, but they don't need to know how to calculate those things. I think that this information is just something that they can memorize without necessarily having a really firm grasp on inflation and unemployment like they're going to have by the end of this unit. So let's cover the big relationships between the big three indicators and then show how they show up on the business cycle. So the big relationships that we want to focus on here are that GDP and inflation have a direct relationship. So as GDP increases, we expect to see inflation rates increasing as well, which is basically reflecting an increase in the number of dollars chasing after our scarce goods. So as GDP goes up, more people have jobs, those people have more money, everybody goes to the store looking to purchase the same goods and services, and this creates what's called demand pull inflation. We'll get into that a little bit later on in the unit. The kids also need to know that inflation and unemployment, at least in the short run, have an inverse relationship. So if one is going up, we expect the other to go down and vice versa. The kids also need to know that GDP and unemployment tend to have an inverse relationship, which I think the kids don't have a lot of difficulty with because it kind of makes sense. As GDP goes up and we produce more products, we basically just need to hire more people to produce those products, and as we hire people, it drives down the unemployment rate. Another important thing that you may want to point out about the business cycle is I've drawn the trend line here. Now, this is kind of an ideal trend. This is what we'd like to see. Of course, that's not always realistic to what's really going to happen. But that although the economy ebbs and flows, a properly regulated, properly run economy will have a long-term trend line that shows positive growth. So, decade over decade, we should be able to produce more stuff, even though year over year that may not necessarily be the case, just because of changes in the business cycle. So the last set of relationships the kids will need to memorize for this kind of mini lesson here is exactly what is happening to GDP, inflation, and unemployment at each point on the business cycle. So let's kind of walk these through in the order that I have them on the business cycle over here. So we'll know that the economy is at its peak when GDP is basically maxed out. A little bit later on when we draw the long-run aggregate supply curve, when we make it to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve, that is a pretty good indicator that we are either at the peak or getting really, really close to the peak. The kids won't know what that means right now, but you can bring it up a little bit later on. When we're at the peak, the economy is at full employment, meaning that the unemployment rate is going to fall all the way to the natural rate of unemployment. And we are experiencing, generally speaking, high inflation. That's not true for every single business cycle, but for the most part, we'd expect to see elevated levels of inflation when we get nearer to the peak. When the economy experiences a downturn, we go into recession, you start to see GDP falling. In fact, that's how we know we're in a recession, as you start to see negative GDP. The unemployment rate starts to rise as businesses start to lay off their employees, and we start to see lower levels of inflation representing fewer dollars chasing after fewer goods. So as people lose their jobs, they have less disposable income. There's not as much shopping going on, and you'll see a reduction in that demand pull inflation. When the economy bottoms out in the trough, GDP basically reaches its lowest possible point. We have maximum levels of unemployment, including very, very high levels of cyclical unemployment, and we expect to see very, very low inflation. If the trough is deep enough, you may actually see deflation, which is basically a negative inflation rate. Kids tend to want to associate falling prices with being a good thing, but you may want to point out here that the only time your economy will ever see deflation is if you are in basically a really, really bad recession or a really, really bad depression. And that when you trough out, when the economy hits its lowest point, you might see lowering prices, but that's a really, really bad sign. Because if your economy starts to experience deflation, you can actually trigger a deflationary spiral, which is something we're going to cover in the next unit. You could just tell them deflationary spirals are really, really, really bad. They don't need to know why. Just tell them to take your word for it. It's not a good thing when prices start to fall. Then inevitably, the economy will start to recover again. We see increases in GDP. We see an unemployment rate that begins to fall, and slowly but surely you'll start to see the building of elevated inflation rates. So for where we're at right now, our economy has been in recovery essentially since 2009, so we've had a slow but very long recovery. But we're starting to see a little bit of inflation pop up. Full employment, we're basically right next to it. We're really, really close to what most economists consider full employment. And so we can take a look at our current indicators and kind of guesstimate where we are on the business cycle, probably toward the tail end of that recovery, although knock on wood, maybe the good times will last a little bit longer. Real quick lesson, doesn't take me an entire class period, but I like to go through this stuff just so that the kids can recognize the business cycle before we tear into the unemployment rate and inflation.